get out of here. At the bottom? Okay. And there. Already opened it up? Maybe come where you. Right there. Okay, great. Well, I appreciate you asked me to come here and share with you today. I thought the remarks from Michael Daniels were very, very appropriate for this. Escape here. Okay, so I know you all should know about the National Strategy for Information Sharing and Safeguarding, and if you haven't already heard about that, you probably haven't been around Shermendra very long because he's a great promoter. And you've probably also heard about the information sharing environment. Can we try to figure out what that is? And in that plan, there's lots of things we can talk about in that plan. I'm going to focus on a couple things that I think are very important with regard to how the ISE can support this plan. Number one, this is John's perspective. Really what we want to do is reduce information sharing friction. The ISE should be able to do that. So we're not working on an end by end. Every information exchange is hard to do. What can we reuse? We want to basically increase the volume and velocity of information sharing. We want to reduce risk. That's the safeguarding piece here. That doesn't mean eliminate risk. And one of the things that we heard from Michael Daniels this morning was that if we have transparency, if we increase that transparency, we then can have the rich conversations we really need when we sit down to have this information sharing discussion. A lot of it right now is surface. We need to get down into some of the details. We're going to do the cybersecurity. And then really increase the agility and the resiliency, because we don't have the time or the resources to do this over and over and over. The ISE has got to be agile. It's got to be not brittle so that we can move forward. So I have a lot of simple pictures in my presentation here because I think we try to make this real complicated enough if we can make it as simple as possible. How many of you in the room have been in this scenario? Someone has information and you want it. Someone has, and you want to make sure all the right rules and things happen there. The hardest part about that when you're getting in a room is typically not the technology, right? The hardest part is getting agreement. And very often I'll say interoperability is equivalent to getting agreements. How do we get that agreement? Because we need agreement across lots of different dimensions. You know, what are the business requirements we have to meet? We need to agree on what information we're going to share and how we're going to represent that information, the semantics and the syntax, and things like NEAM help us do that. We need to make sure the right security is in place, make sure the right people get access to the right information. How are we going to govern this? And hey, by the way, when something bad happens, and bad things do happen, how do we handle the liability? And how do we make it so that the liability and the bad things don't stop us from sharing more and more information that we need to share? So just a couple concepts here. Direct trust, okay? So you sit down across the table for somebody, you have a direct trust relationship. There's a lot of this going on out there in the ISE today, okay? Direct trust tends to be forgiving. Okay, if you've got a relationship with somebody and you've done business with them before, sometimes all the I's are dotted and all the T's are crossed. You share information, a lot of point-to-point things going on. Third-party trust, okay? So I don't know you, but I know somebody who knows you, and I trust that third party. It's kind of how PKI works with certificate authorities and so forth. It's kind of how your federations work. There's a federation manager that the different parties trust and buy into that third-party trust. There's also reputational trust out there, right? You're big. I need your information. You're a federal agency. You're Google. Maybe I shouldn't trust you then, or Facebook. So a lot of decisions and information sharing is based on these reputational decisions out there today. All of these carry this concept of residual risk, right? Because none of these models are perfect. So as we start to look at the ISC as a whole, we are going to leverage these different kinds of trust relationships that are in play there. We need to figure out how to pull them in and manage that residual risk. This gets much more complicated when we're not doing this end by end, right? Multiple communities of interest, lots of different partners changing over time. And it's not just about the agreement, it's about the trust. How do I know that what agreement we had in place is going to be maintained and lifecycle managed over time? How do I know that you're doing what you said you were going to do? How do I know you even know what you're doing and what your policies say. See, because ground truth is, when you've been doing this for a while, you realize different relationships were all over the map. And this is kind of the as-is that we somehow have to make sense of going forward. So when it comes to agreement and scale, the number of participants, communities of interest, use cases, technical patterns, as that grows, what happens? We really need to agree on more things. There's just more things we need to get agreement on. But the reality is, it's just harder to get that agreement. You put more people in the room, it's just harder and harder to get agreement and maintain that agreement and that level of assurance and that trust over time. So here's the reality. So I came up with what I call the Ise Facts of Life, okay? And this is the cards that we've been dealt here trying to solve this problem, right? Not all the use cases are known up front, so you're not going to get them. Not all the requirements are known up front. In fact, you don't even know who all the stakeholders are. So when you say, well, we're going to have a meeting, we're going to get everybody in the room, good luck. You know, you don't know who the everybody is right now. And we don't have a green field. You kind of got to leverage, you can't fund it top down, so you're going to have to leverage where people are at and what you got. Adoption doesn't happen. Anyone who's been trying to push anything, you know adoption is key, but adoption is hard to get, right? Sometimes it's like pushing that noodle. They're on, they're off, they're on, they're off. That's just a fact of life. And it's going to happen over a very long period of time, and once you think you got it figured out, think again, it already changed, okay? So I think this is one of those things, like a 12-step process. You need to kind of realize the facts of life and the cards. This is a hard problem to solve, okay? So the brave ones are here in this room. So really, this is my picture for trying to solve this problem. Of course we need security, privacy, trust, interoperability, and we throw those words out. You know, Steve Ambrosini mentioned this morning, we need to define what do we mean by interoperability, right? Not just technical interoperability, so all the things actually do work. But we got to do that in a way that it scales, that it's not brittle, that we can life cycle manage this, and that's really the challenge. So if we look at a use case, look at law enforcement. Law enforcement is the perfect use case to look at because it's very decentralized. There's 18,000 law enforcement agencies, as Shamendra mentioned this morning. Federal, state, local. You cannot centrally fund this group. They have a lot of ongoing projects. This maps to reality. They have a real legitimate need to share information with each other. They have lots of different rules. There's lots of different kinds of information, from criminal intelligence to criminal history. They have legitimate need to talk with other communities of interest. So this is a pretty good use case for us to solve this problem and learn some lessons. So when we look at it from the ISC perspective, the vision, okay, this is what would be nice. We have one identity, one mobile device. I know who you are. You get access to everything you need to get access to, whether it's local or with your partners, and all the right things happen. And so the problem is all the right things happen. So we got to figure out what that is. So there's a lot of initiatives out there, and of course identity management is a huge part of this, and things like FICAM and SICAM and NSTIC and BAE and GFIPM, a number of initiatives out there, because we have this intuitive understanding that we need to federate the identity. But there's some implications. When we separate the identity provider, the one who vets the users and authenticates the user, from those agencies that have the resources themselves that want to control who has access to that, there's protocols that allow us to solve this problem, there's some implications. And also, identity providers, if you want to do ABAC, they don't have all the attributes. They have some attributes, and if those of you are familiar with things like the PIV-I cards, they don't have a lot of attributes on that card. So somehow we have an organization providing attributes, an organization that has a resource, and an organization that's going to identity proof and vet the users. It's not all built into one organization. And so what about now? This becomes a big barrier and challenge. What about trust? What about liability, security, privacy, interoperability? And that's really, the answer to that is really the ISE needs to address that. Okay, so we know federated ICAM, but how do we address these other aspects in a holistic place? Because those are the hardest things when you get in the room. It's not picking the one standard you're going to agree on. So I borrowed this slide from Tom Smedingoff from the American Bar Association. And the answer to this really comes down to this concept of a trust framework. And it may be a familiar term to those in the identity management space, but maybe not so much for folks that aren't in that space. And really what it is, a trust framework represents the technical and operational specifications. Typically, your tech geeks know what those things are, your privacy standards, and I know that the SEC and project interoperability are working on collecting a lot of those as reference ones in projects, and those are underpinned with common law, the existing law. And then there's the legal rules, right? What happens when, who owns stuff, and termination rights, and dispute, and all that. And typically a trust framework will bind a stakeholder with a contract or some kind of agreement to both the legal rules and to the technical operational specifications. Now, the challenge is there's not one trust framework out there, okay? There's lots of them, and a lot of times you won't call it a trust framework, you'll call it a network, a consortium, or enterprise architecture. I mean, there's 100 names for these things. Here's some examples. They tend to focus on maybe a community of interest or a particular problem. I mean, one's in the educational with In Common to connect higher education. It's a federation. You say, hey, well, what does that have to do with, cybersecurity? And a lot. I'll tell you, your universities are getting pounded by attacks, especially your higher-end engineering universities. You get tens and tens of thousands a day attempt. The other ones, like you're familiar with, probably with the ICAM initiative at the federal level, FBI sieges, endlets, and it goes on and on and on. These are just a few samples that are out there in play today. So when we look with a lot of these trust frameworks in play today, each with their own members, each requiring many dimensions of agreement, right? Technical, policy, so forth, they tend to be what I would call monolithic and opaque. If you're not a member of the club, if you're not in that trust framework as a member, it's really hard from the outside to assess how you measure up unless you go through their process. Okay, so from the outside, are you 10% off or are you 90% off? It's really hard to assess that. So the question becomes is what if an identity provider in one of these trust frameworks tries to get access to a relying party or a resource in another one? Because really, again, reduce the friction for information sharing, increase the volume and velocity. The Ise, we need a strategy for how we do that because ground truth is many of these things exist today. Okay, so back in 2008, as an outgrowth of the Global Federated Identity and Privilege Management Initiative, GFIPM, which was a global FACA, Department of Justice, state and local partnership strategy for how we address this in the law enforcement area. We said we need an operational framework. Something was operational, more than just the spec itself. We need partners, we need agreement, that other parts that I showed you there in the trust framework. So NEF was stood up with a number of partners for that very reason, to provide that operational trust framework, and also with all these initiatives that are coming out, because lots of people are trying to solve this problem at the same time, state and locals tend to look at that and say, wow, there's FICAM, there's SICAM, there's BAE, there's NSTIC, there's GFIPM, I got my own thing over here. When there's a lot of things coming at them from the same time, what happens? One or two things. They do nothing, or they invent their own. Okay, and both of those are bad for us in the Ise. So that's one of the missions that NEF took on. So we started to grow out that federation with a number of partners, the federal, state, local. Operationally, it's running today, information sharing. But at that time, we started to run into some challenges. And these are challenges I'd like to share with you because I think if you've been doing this, you probably are familiar with many of these challenges. One of the challenges is called the interfederation problem, okay? That people can take standards and they can implement them just a little bit different, or they can put their own governance, they can put their own policies around that, and what you end up with is silos of excellence, right? So lots of different silos that are very, very close, and we were bumping up against that. It was hard to get everyone to join one thing. So that was a problem. Second problem we ran into was what I call the all or nothing relationship, okay? Over time, frameworks have to evolve, right? Because there's new technical patterns. You have SAML, then next thing you got OAuth and OpenID Connect, and you have a different way of sharing attributes. And as requirements change, these frameworks tend to be like a snowball rolling down a hill, picking up new requirements. And if every member of your federation or your Ise has to meet all of those requirements, not going to work, okay? And then the third challenge we fell into was this constant change and evolving requirements here tend to punish. That's a little anvil that fell on the guy's head. Tends to punish. I actually had an animated slide, which was a little bit. It was PG-13 rated, so I just put the still in here. So the early adopters, the very people we need to do something first, are the ones that often get the anvil on their head. We punish them, right? They're the guinea pigs. Come on in. We bring them in. They spend some resources, some capital in convincing their management to get on board. Here's one of my guinea pigs right here. Okay, to get on board, and then what happens is things change. So we need to figure out a way of solving that problem. So these were three big challenges that we were running into, and so there was an opportunity under the national strategy, a White House initiative, National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace, to put in for a grant request. We said, hey, this problem, well, it's facing us in the law enforcement, and it's a really common problem that's going to face a lot of the people trying to solve this kind of problem out there. Put together a team, put in our application, and we were selected. And our approach for this was, well, what if these trust frameworks were componentized? And much like if you look at, many in the room probably are familiar with NEAM. And NEAM, people used to build their hard-coded information exchanges, and then NEAM says, look, just don't do that. Let's come up with a repeatable process. Let's come up with standard components that you can extend and subset, use as building blocks, and then build within a business context, a particular exchange. So what if we applied that same thinking to trust frameworks, to more holistic, to not just the data exchange part, but to other things that are there too? If we could do that, we can standardize some of these components, we get greater transparency, we'd have great ease of comparing two trust frameworks to know the distance between those, and potential for reuse. And even better, what we would get is we wouldn't punish the people that want to participate in multiple of these federations. They could know what the extra lift was to participate in the N+1. So you enable them. They would do this, and that's exactly what they needed, plus this more, and then I could do health. Swap out law enforcement attributes, put in health attributes. So because a lot of things are common, it's just hard to cull them out without a particular framework. So those reusable components is what we call trust marks. Okay, so that's the basis and foundation of the idea. Think of trust marks as what I would call mini reusable certifications, because there's many certifications out there, but we tend to certify it holistically. Think about these as mini certifications. In our framework, trust marks are not a little icon that you stick on your website, okay, although there's a lot of confusion about that. Trustmark is an actual machine-readable artifact that represents either some technical aspects, some trust, cryptographic aspect, privacy, security, business requirement, or even some legal aspect as well. You take these individual trust marks at a granular level, and then you can bundle them into a particular business context to solve a problem. So if you're doing an SBU information sharing problem, you can bundle this set. If you're doing a justice health type problem, you may use 75% of the same components and have 25% of the new components as well. And because they're machine readable, you can search those through automated processes, and you can evaluate those through automated processes as well. I'll get into a little bit more detail here. So in a Trustmark-based ecosystem, I'm depicting here the red line is 3 separate trust frameworks, 3 separate nameworks that exist today. And typically what happens is you go through some kind of onboarding process, agreement process, and you become a member of that club. So imagine that these frameworks articulated their requirements in terms of, instead of a monolithic set of documents, but in terms of what we call a TIP, Trust Interoperability Profile, a set of reusable components that captured the same set of requirements. Okay? You could then issue those components to the individual stakeholders, identity providers, resource owners, attribute providers, and that. And that those trust marks that you issue them, those components, would be issued by what we call a trust mark provider in our framework. Now, initially, the trust mark provider is probably the federation operator or the owner of that trust framework, but it doesn't have to be. Because you can imagine that different trust mark providers may has specializations. Some may be better at doing privacy audits, or security audits, or interoperability testing like Springboard and those kinds of things. And now you create a marketplace for best of breed who can certify different aspects of an information sharing agreement. These trust marks can be placed into registries, much like DNS. And you can go and search those because they have a regular structure to them. We can find out about if someone supports a particular privacy aspect or so forth. So in order to make this work, okay, there needs to be a little bit of rigor around what we call trustmark definitions. So a trustmark, we can't look at them lightly. They have to, a trustmark has to mean something. It has to be clear what it does mean. Because at the end of the day, you would like multiple trustmark providers issuing these trustmarks. So two things I want to hit here. Everything in this framework is machine readable, even the specs themselves. The specs themselves are written in XML. Now, of course, there's an HTML rendering those so a human can read those, but the reason we did that is we want to automate the requirement itself through tools, and that's what's necessary in order to automate assessments and to do auto discovery. Conformance criteria is one thing I want to talk about. So you're probably familiar with conformance criteria if you've written standards or there's well-defined things that you must do. But one thing that's very often missing is the assessment process. Okay? A consistent assessment process that says, if I'm a third-party auditor, what must I do? What must I capture? What tests must I go through in order to assert that this endpoint, that this system conforms to the conformance criteria? And that's where this is a little unique as well. And this is all in a machine-readable format. So let me give you an example. As part of this NSTIC initiative, it's been ongoing for about 18 months now. As part of this, we've built 62 of these granular trustmark definitions that cover things like FICAM, LOA2, and LOA3, a lot of the GFIPM and law enforcement requirements that are out there. But again, it's applicable 800-53 low impact security controls as well. Like I said, the specs are written in XML with HTML. You can go to that URL. You can certainly see those. An example, for example, is FICAM LOA2 registration issuance. That seems to be an important thing that should matter to people if you're going to engage with them. How do you register and issue credentials to people? Is it face-to-face? Is it just they sent in $9.95 and over the internet you gave them, a credential? That's important. So if we take a look at this particular example here, for that particular trustmark definition, there's 25 conformance criteria. Things like the trusted registration authority perform identity proofing. Seems like that's a good thing to do, have a trusted registration authority to resist the token issuance tampering. And every one of these conformance criteria is grounded in a reference. So these two in particular, 800-63, and also the FICAM Trust Framework Provider process. So you can cull out and find that same requirement was in two different source documents, actually meant the same thing. So in addition to the conformance criteria, the assessment step. So for that same, to meet those 25 conformance criteria, we've established 47 assessment steps. It's not necessarily one-to-one. It may take multiple assessment steps to satisfy, say that you've satisfied a conformance criteria. So in here, and very often there's a step that may be upload your policy, call out the part of the policy, or it may be actually cut the actual transaction on the wire, and it must conform to this particular pattern or so forth. There's a lot of flexibility in the framework, and the authors of the trustmark definitions get to determine how rigorous that assessment process should be and how much latitude you want. So realize, perfect conformance is infinite cost, right? So you're not going to have perfect conformance. And who best to establish where that bar is in the amount of the assessment steps you need to do? Probably the authors of the spec that put the intent in there. And today, that's why we have a lot of people, if you've been involved in standards, you have a lot of, here's a standard, how many times do you hear, thing it's been, is people claiming, yeah, we name that too, and we do that, and then it doesn't work. Because they have lots of profiles in them. There's different bars on assessment that they must measure up to. This provides that consistency, which is going to be necessary in the ISE. Also, like I said, you can build these into a bundle, what we call a tip for business context. Here's just an example of one here. I did decide not to show you all the nitty-gritty XML, but conceptually. So for this bundle says, this identity provider organization that wants to participate in this business case, let's say it's SBU, should have the FICAM SAML single sign-on trustmark, should have a LOA2 trustmark, should have a certain set of attributes, and should have a certain privacy policy. This isn't a real one. This is just for example. And whether they're must or should, there's some optionality. You build that in, the authors of these tips, and who you can get these trust marks from. Right? So you say, oh, this trust mark can come from either this NEEF in this case, or IGIS, or this can come from Contara, which is a private sector trust mark provider, or any trust mark provider will do for this particular aspect, because we're not going to be, we just want to make sure somebody put eyeballs on it. You could even say these aspects you're allowed to have self-assessment on. And that's important because that self-assessment is kind of an on-ramp. There's a lot of that going on today. You don't want to put heavy requirements. You maybe start off with self-assessment criteria, and then over time you back off and put more third-party validation into various different aspects of the tips. So we've made quite a bit of progress to date. I'm sure these slides are going to be sent out to everybody. So there's some URLs in here. We have a technical framework document, which has quite a bit in there, so feel free to take a look at that. Like I said, we've built 62 of these Trustmark definitions. They're 1.0 versions. They will be changing. One of the things that we've learned is that getting the granularity on the Trustmark definitions right is essential. Because the bigger the chunk, probably the less reusable. The smaller the chunk, the more reusable when you try to look across lots of policies. We've had engineers for 3-4 months at a time have 3 or 4 different kinds of frameworks in there, going line by line, you know, saying this is the same as the intent of this language, the exact same as the intent of this language, then calling the authors and finding out whether it is or isn't. And so there's a lot of engineering work behind some of these here. We've also built some tools that will eventually make their way out into the public sector here. Tools for assessors, for example. So you can take all these, let's say there's a requirement. You say, I have these 10 trust marks are required for this business context. This tool will ingest the specs for those 10 trust mark definitions and walk an auditor through every one of the assessment steps that and the evidence that needs to be collected, and then automatically generate the trust mark, digitally sign it, and post it into a registry. That's key. So real quick, I'm going to hit a couple things, and I'm going to let James come up here. We've also built a legal framework because this kind of a model is different than your typical framework of everyone signing an agreement in the middle. You have trust mark providers, you have recipients that receive trust marks, and then you have others that rely on it. And getting those agreement framework in place is important. So we've got that in place. We've piloted this with a number of participants. Many of you are probably familiar with NLETs and RIS and LA County, both as a service provider and with their sheriffs, and Texas Department of Public Safety. We've actually issued them. That's operational today, so it's not a science experiment. We're a little bit past that at this point. And one of the main reasons we did this was to say, how do we cross communities of interest and those that are different? And so we have a pipeline now of Florida, Alabama, NCRIC, and several others, but one that's particularly interesting is this justice to health scenario connecting mental health and substance abuse with an overlapping set of trust marks. Of course, they're going to have some unique ones as well with the typical law enforcement public safety. So those are all in a pipeline. And also in our pipeline is Pennsylvania Justice Network. And James is here to tell you a little bit about that and Justice Network. And I really appreciate him driving all the way up from Pennsylvania today. I know that was a challenge. So URL for your more information. Let me get James set up here. Is this yours, James?
Okay, I've been queued at 10 minutes, so we'll definitely try to stick to it because I think we want to leave some time for questions. So what I'll do is maybe ask you to cut me off at 5, if that's okay. Thanks, Martha. Okay, first off, I'd like to thank everyone for the opportunity to talk to you a little bit about what the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania has been doing. I definitely am one of those guys with the anvil over the head. In one of the projects I'm going to share with you, we kind of ran into a lot of the problems that John had highlighted, and we're now taking this new approach with Trustmarks in one of our other projects. So without any further ado, I'm not sure, how many folks in the room understand or have ever heard of JNET, the Commonwealth Justice Network? Okay, good. We have a fair number. For those that are not familiar, I'm going to kind of fast forward through a couple of these front-end slides to try to catch up with where we're at. Basically, under former Governor Ridge, there was a need to put together a lot of the Commonwealth agencies that deal with justice, our courts, state police, corrections, parole, probation, and move towards timely information sharing. So I'm going to kind of fast forward through a number of this. We are connected statewide, have over 40 applications, online applications we run with over 35 common services that we share out to local, county, as well as state agency and federal agencies. Most important slide here probably is our budget. It is a time of budget crunch for a lot of folks. This represents the Commonwealth JNET budget over the last years that I've at least been with the Commonwealth. One of the biggest points here I want to bring out is the yellow box. This yellow box, we went in for a program review request asking for money well above our budget. During the time we knew that it was going to continue over the next 5 years to depreciate. We at that time made some pretty wise decisions. We put in enterprise service bus and moving our security out of our applications. That positioned us really for where we're at today and taking advantage of a lot of the opportunities of what we're talking about today. So I just wanted to highlight that. You know, agencies are being required to do more information sharing, less money. And it is possible. We're a perfect use case for that, and I think this kind of shows that it is certainly possible. Why Trustmarks? We've probably all seen a slide very similar to this. JNET's no exception. Within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, we have an identity, credential, and access work group. I know John brought up how do you keep track of all these programs that are hitting states? Well, in our state, we tend to put together these domain teams, and we collaborate. Dr. Frank Morrow, who maybe some of you are working with on the NSTIC, Pennsylvania was awarded one of the NSTIC grants and is also working in another area in the Commonwealth to move towards the whole Trustmark concept with their project as well. And we're coordinating on that. FICAM, a lot of the FRAC initiatives that are going on. Frank's been involved in that area. I've been fairly heavy involved in the global federated identity space. Internal to the Commonwealth, we've got the same struggle. I got a JNET ID, I got a Commonwealth ID, I do my logging and timekeeping with my Commonwealth ID, I log into the justice system with another identity. I mean, we all have these problems both internally and externally. And certainly we're looking towards minimizing those within our Commonwealth. We have some of our agencies with 5 or 6 identity credentials. Obviously, a lot of headaches go along with that. Multiple sign-ons, login changes, you know, keeping all these things organized. It's a mess. So really, a lot of this use case started back in probably 2004, where partners of WIS and JNET and forget our other CISANET, I believe was our other partner, went in. Department of Homeland Security awarded some of the first grants to begin looking at why we wanted to move towards a federated identity. I want to kind of shift real quick over to 2 projects. This first project I brought up is a Trustmark project, and it's Commonwealth of Pennsylvania had business requirements to stand up a new gang system. Gang inquiry with a lot of data sources in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And when our business analysts got to looking at this, we were like, why are we going to go build this? We already have some partners that have great applications. You know, management's like, why am I going to spend money on this? I got limited dollars, you know. I need to reuse this stuff. We got federated identity we could put in place here. And let's talk about that. I know this is a very complex slide. I'm going to try to simplify it. Very simple. JNET has data sources we wanted to share. RISNet has risk gang application. Why should we rebuild it? We can take the JNET users to the front door of RIS using federated identity with Trustmarks, common Trustmarks that need to be established, and we're in that phase 2 of Trustmarks with this project of onboarding, looking at our policies and procedures and the risk policies and procedures, and let our users use the front-end application of RIS. RIS would, with this service bus, make calls with our users back into JNET and any other RIS users that they wanted to authorize to run this RIS gang. We'll look at those, inspect those federated identities, and we'll run and collect all the gang resource data we have and send it back over to RIS and let RIS display all that information back to the end user. Again, this is just kind of one of those things of unlocking a lot of the potential when you have shared partners that have common trust marks between them. This is like kind of an added value perspective of what comes out of this. There's a lot of other things in RIS that are going to be unlocked for our JNET users. All the yellow boxes here represent additional application and additional functionality. Kind of an unintended benefit of really moving towards this direction. Shifting gears, I know I've been getting 5 minutes, so I want to try to clean up here. MERIS. MERIS is the Mid-Atlantic Regional Information Sharing Project. There were 3 different phases carved out of this. The first 2 deal with bulk data sharing and using the integrated criminal justice systems within each of the states to take that bulk data in and run it against watch lists. One of the big use cases for this was parole and probationers watching for arrests out of state. Our state's finding, we have a data link set up with Maryland where 400 Maryland arrests on average a day, and 2 of those right now, and Philadelphia is not reporting in this for Pennsylvania, but 2 of those are Pennsylvania people on active parole. So we're now getting our hands around real data, real business around this. Phase 3 is the federated person search, and this is where we ran into a lot of those initial problems that John was talking about by creating a participation agreement and pushing ourselves into another information sharing project and looking at now how we're going to unlock that potentially with the Trustmark solution. So again, this is a diagram, and it really shows a JNET user will stay within the JNET portal to get to all the data that we're sharing. We're going to unlock in this 3rd phase where we would unlock data from Maryland, from Delaware, and the District of Columbia. District of Columbia has a very similar system to JNET, and it's called Justice. It's an integrated justice system here in DC. Maryland has the Maryland Dashboard, which is their integrated justice system, and Delaware has a system called Dyche. And all their users will stay in their portals, and the data will be retrieved and brought back into the portals that they commonly live in. So again, this project not necessarily done with Trustmarks, but is also using the federated, the GFIPM standards that were initially put together, which will be a Trustmark. I'm going to kind of clean up there because I definitely want to leave some room for questions, and probably I'll turn it back over here to John. Thank you.
Any questions? Do you want folks to come on down to the mic here? Okay. Are you recording this?
Yes.
Oh man. Iveta, how are we doing?
Hi, good afternoon. I have a question regarding architecting solutions with Trustmarks. When we did federation the traditional way with GFIPM, what we did is we had this entity, a trusted identity broker. And I have a question, what is the future of a trusted identity broker when the Trustmarks will breach identities at a different level?
Short answer and long answer. Okay. So the trusted identity broker, the original intent, this is one of the constructs that were in the GFIPM model. One of the constructs was if you're using a standard, federated standard like GFIPM, not everyone uses that federated standard. So you could put a broker in there to broker foreign technologies basically into the standard. One of the challenges with that in establishing trust, if the different identity native organizations and how they vet their users and the policies that they use are not transparent through the broker, that's problematic to establishing trust, right? So the thing is, if the broker could take the trust marks and give them to each of the brokered entities and accurately portray how each of those individual users, per se, were vetted, how the privacy policies of each of those individual organizations being brokered, I think that helps that brokered concept. Brokering from a technology perspective, all good. Brokering from a very set of different policies and then bundling them into a single policy federation facing is lossy. And so what we're trying to do is not have that loss. Because the trust marks give you that fidelity, if you can push those trust marks through the broker, I think the concept's valid. If you can't, then there's some security problems with it. Sherman?
Thanks, John. I think this is really exciting work. You know, one thing that, you know, maybe didn't come through in the presentation, but I'd like you to comment on is the fact that you're spanning a lot of different organizations that have independent appropriations, independent procurement rules, independent IT development cultures, federal, state, local, nonprofit, private sector. Can you talk a little bit about that aspect of, you know, what you guys have accomplished, and then I think we probably got to transition to the next panel.
Sure. So, so we do, like Sherman said, we do work not only with law enforcement, we do work in the health sector and other sectors as well. One of the things I think the Trustmark framework gives you is that you don't have to eat the whole elephant at the same time. You can build a trust mark in the health, let's say, for informed consent, and push that forward. You can build some trust marks for a privacy aspect and push that forward. It does not have to represent the entirety of your agreement across all sectors, because that's just too hard. So it's not an all or nothing thing. Like I think James mentioned, you know, Maris. So that was another law enforcement federation. The idea that they will use all the exact same trust marks as the NEAT Federation, that's not going to happen, okay? But where those overlaps are, now because we got that transparency, just like in NEAM, no one's going to use all of the data components in NEAM. They're going to want to subset and extend them. And then over time, governance process will drive conformance and some standard good trust marks, and some just may never see the light of day. They may be used one time, and you deprecate those over time. So, thank you.